Read the rest in the bio in your program booklet, but as you can see from what I've just said, she is an expert in her own right on this subject matter. Dr. Mendelsohn-Foreman, I turn the podium over to you to introduce the speakers. We have a very distinguished panel and to kick things off. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Betsy. Just a compliment to Betsy, who is one of the best organized presidents I've ever seen of an event, and I do many of them. So I think, hands off, we need to congratulate her. Thank you. It is indeed an honor, ladies and gentlemen, to be here because while I feel like I'm the spirit of post-conflict past, I also have the spirit of post-conflict present. And I loved the title of the session because optimal results is something that we all aspire to, but unfortunately the real world does not necessarily give us, given the nature that post-conflict, while a development issue, is also a security issue, is also a diplomatic issue, and is something that we all know is an ongoing question that not only our own government but the global community must deal with. So with that, I will say that there are many questions that our panelists are going to raise from three different perspectives. One, our first panelist, Elizabeth Chatvili, who I hope I pronounced your name correctly, who is currently the Deputy Assistant Administrator of USID, will speak. She will be followed by Larry Sampler, who's the Acting Principal Deputy Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization at the State Department, and Dr. James Scheer, who has recently been appointed the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Partnership Strategy and Stability Operations, and he's only on the job about a week, but this is a portfolio that my colleague Jim Scheer knows very well from his previous life at the Department of Defense. I should also point out that, as Betsy has mentioned, there are extensive bios of each of these individuals, but just let me say that these three perspectives, from the AID perspective, from the State Department perspective, and the Department of Defense, demonstrate how the nexus of security and development have evolved and how the interagency collaboration has evolved since the time when we were first grappling with these issues at the end of the Cold War. And I think as you hear these presentations today, and we'll have ample time for questions, you will understand how far we've come and yet how many questions remain unresolved and need to be resolved not only by us as citizens of the United States, but by our own colleagues around the world. So first, let me give the podium over to Elizabeth, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
You're welcome to present in my place. Thank you, Johanna, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm honored today to speak before the Society for International Development, and looking out among the crowd, I see many colleagues and old friends. I appreciate the breadth of the collective experience represented in the room today. This community of practice represents enormous development wisdom and operational insight on the challenges we as development actors are facing in today's increasingly complicated world. I hope my few comments will challenge us to think beyond our comfort level and to press us just a little bit to be a little bit bolder in our thinking. All of our organizations are facing a daunting array of interconnected problems: the global financial crisis, alarming food insecurity, weakened states with little capacity to govern themselves, violent threats from conflict entrepreneurs, all of which infinitely complicate the development challenge we collectively seek to address. In the face of these challenges, we as development actors must become better prepared to adapt and respond. We must fundamentally reconsider and ultimately transform our traditional ways of engaging these difficult problems and their daily manifestations. Many here in Washington have named a more thoughtful approach, a transformed or integrated approach, smart power, a term which has come to signify the appropriate harmonization between hard military and soft civilian power tools and resources. Understanding smart power has pushed us to re-examine our foreign policy tools and consider how best to update them for the 21st century. The creation of SCRS and the Civilian Response Corps are manifestations of some of these valuable new tools, as is, I hope, the continuing revitalization of my own agency. What I'd like to focus on today, however, is not the architecture of this approach, leaving that for my colleagues and the Q&A later on, but rather the philosophical orientation behind our soft power approach. In other words, smart development practices in R&S environments. There is considerable discussion in Washington on critical structural reforms USAID must undertake to become a transformed development agency and a faster, more responsive interagency partner, flexible enough to link short and long-term responses based on adequate analysis of these complex situations. Many of you are leading these discussions, and your contributions to the debate on what will make USAID the standard bearer for U.S. government development implementation is indeed welcomed. The reforms being discussed are absolutely essential and long overdue. Perhaps an equally challenging consideration, however, is how to build new partnerships and achieve impact in complex or post-conflict environments. In this regard, I'm standing in the shadow of many intellectual giants who have broken critical ground in considering how to fix failed states, while pursuing new modalities of development assistance in general and specifically in R&S situations. I'm grateful for the work of Ashraf Ghani and Claire Lockhart of the Institute of State Effectiveness, whose new book, Fixing Failed States, argues for a reorientation in donor practice in building effective, capable states. They outline core state functions and then explore pragmatic ways for implementing the goal and functions of capable states. Many of the best practices they articulate should, in my humble opinion, be adopted by development actors, and I'll highlight in a moment which ones resonate most deeply with me. I think it was Ashraf who once lectured me by saying USAID is using 20th century practices to address 21st century problems. Their book, in addition to my own personal experience working in many fragile or conflict environments, crystallized for me USAID's own mixed experiences in state building. It's clear in all contexts, not just in R&S environments, that USAID and other donors need to stop trying to be in the lead. We must move away from practices which, albeit inadvertently, cultivate aid dependency and which continuously project and then seek to build Western-centric approaches or institutions on top of culturally distinct practices and orientations. In fact, we must now contend with the backlash against globalization in many of the countries in which we work. To quote from The Accidental Gorilla by my friend David Kilcullen, quote, "Traditional societies have experienced the effects of globalization on deeply held social, cultural, and religious identities, sparking violent antagonism to Western-led modernization and its preeminent symbol, the perceived U.S. cultural and economic imperialism," unquote. Perhaps not having learned from our experiences in many countries, especially in weak, conflict-affected states, we, in a very well-intentioned manner, see ourselves as coming to the rescue. So often the political imperatives of a response to a state in crisis push us as donors to default to doing things for the host country, pushing our own ideas of institution building, bypassing in some countries host nation budgetary processes because of lack of capacity or corruption. Each of these choices undercuts our ultimate success in partnering to build stronger, more effective, and legitimate states. So if we hold ourselves to a higher standard of not continuing to repeat some of the mistakes of state building in the past, how should we chart a development and R&S approach for the 21st century using this century's best practices? I'll use my remaining time to highlight 3 critical themes to reorient our soft power approach to development assistance in R&S situations to avoid repeating the same mistakes in the future. 1, building new partnerships among the donor community and with host nation communities and governments, characterized by joint responsibility, mutual accountability, and local ownership, as codified in the Paris Declaration. 2, indigenization or alignment, as called for in the Paris Declaration, a recognition and commitment to stop projecting in every case our norms and systems in favor of support for more locally adapted models and approaches to community development. And 3, a new orientation toward and true commitment to capacity building, especially in environments where we as donors are tempted to act for the government or to default to a do-it-for-them approach. Use these 3 principles as a general framework for how we need to operate where circumstances permit. Partnership model. I know that the imperatives of cultivating new and different partnerships and seeking meaningful local ownership is quite clear to this audience. What is much more difficult is actually forging trusting, inclusive partnerships built on mutual accountability and true local ownership over the development process and impact, and validating those partnerships by ensuring we all deliver on commitments. A true partnership model calls for collaboration among new development actors, both in a host country and between donor countries. There are now a proliferation of new organizations, even countries, pursuing development, each of which has its own philosophical orientation and unique business model. New donors such as China, Brazil, the Arab states, and India have exploded onto the scene, offering unique capabilities and certainly different development models for host nations to choose among. USAID is forging partnerships with these new donors and really is taking the time to examine which each of them is offering and how their approaches may differ from our own. For example, if India were to partner with Nepal on a parliamentary strengthening system, how would it differ from USAID's own traditional legislative strengthening program? Is the India model better suited for its neighbor Nepal or not? Critically, many conflict-affected countries or weak and failing states, government legitimacy is at the core of the conflict or institutional vulnerability. And yet it is widely accepted that legitimacy can't and should never be imposed from the outside. As donors, we must tread very carefully here. We may seek to balance our approach between investing directly in capacity building for the host nation while also cultivating strong civil society networks who are empowered to demand accountability and monitor human rights. However, if we are really conscientious about not overly projecting our Western ideals of pluralism, we must first listen intently to the host nation's intentions, demands, and expectations about how they are pursuing legitimizing processes. Then we will be better prepared to support their unique visions for building legitimacy and accountability between the governing and the governed. Here, Mary Anderson's Listening Project may provide insights we could all benefit from as we think about this issue. There is a wide range of potential partnership models with different organizations and government actors with host nations that USAID is pursuing. In Colombia, for example, we are supporting the Colombian government's democratic security strategy to extend state presence to recently recovered areas. Donors in Colombia are supporting a strong state in achieving its own unique vision for cultivating trust between the governed and the governing populations. Unfortunately, unlike the case in Colombia, we haven't always been successful in our endeavors to support locally driven, legitimate institution-building processes, but we are trying. Indigenization. What I mean when I call for greater indigenization of development models is the search for locally influenced and adaptive approaches to good governance, legitimacy, meeting human security needs, and the provision of services. Many host nation communities are throwing up the brakes and asking us to stop overwhelming them with our westernization, our brand of morality, our particularly Americanized approach. A good example of a constructive and locally adapted approach is the National Solidarity Program in Afghanistan. It uniquely binds social and political capital of a range of actors, local and international NGOs, villagers and community leaders, the local and national government of Afghanistan, to pursue community development in a culturally appropriate way. It draws on the leadership and community influence of elected and trusted community development councils to achieve sound, needs-driven community development. Finally, capacity building. Being in the capacity building business cannot continue to mean seeking solutions to problems by acting for or on behalf of host nation partners. 30 years ago, USAID invested in its officers who served in many places around the globe as capable advisors and mentors who formed long-standing professional relationships with their host country counterparts to build true governance and deliver services. And yet, in RNS environments, there is a fundamental tension between investing in medium to long-term capacity building programs and needing to quickly stabilize or arrest violent conflict. This tension has not been reconciled, In fact, our short-term and ad hoc solutions to this challenge may have undercut long-term stability in countries like Afghanistan. Several current and former USAID officers are calling for a reevaluation of these practices, and while the provision of technical assistance will remain an important component of many donors' business models, it must be balanced by better host country leaders and government managers who seek to address their own challenges, perhaps by using donor advisors embedded in their offices and ministries. And in conclusion, true partnership models offer great power and potential for cultivating local ownership and ensuring development impact. Indigenization of our models and approaches must be fueled by a continuous search for creative, culturally based approaches to community development. And we must pursue a model of capacity building which truly honors the host nation as the lead. Just as my military colleagues tell me that their role is to support the civilians in USAID, so too our role should be in support, providing mentorship and advice as a true partner in achieving development and stability. Thank you.
Thanks, Zach. I am going to use PowerPoint. I heard Betsy told me no one was using our PowerPoint. I said, we can't do that after lunch. PowerPoint's kind of de rigueur from the U.S. government these days, and so I'm going to use PowerPoint. I could actually do this quite quickly. The question and the challenge is creating optimal outcomes in post-conflict recovery and reconstruction. And this is a shameless plug. But Oxfam and CAP did a White Oaks paper just a few months ago, and if you haven't had a chance to look at it, I encourage you to pull it up and look at it. I don't agree with everything in it. It was a fascinating weekend with some people who I truly consider to be heroes, both in terms of development and diplomacy abroad, but it is a fascinating and a very useful first cut at ways to improve the effectiveness of U.S. development overseas. I do appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's a humbling experience, and if my wife were here, she would say you should be humbled to be in this crowd. And I have to start out by saying that my opinions are only my own. I do represent my office at the Department of State, the Office of the Coordinator for Reconstruction and Stabilization. But the things that I'm going to say today, I intend to be a little bit more provocative than perhaps my boss would have me be, and to do it in 12 minutes. Zach, would you do the next slide, please? I always owe you an outline. I'm going to just cover 6 points. In a setting like this one, with this many incredibly talented and experienced people, there's in my opinion, a tendency to overthink things. And so I'm going to play the dumb guy at the party and focus on some kind of low-level, not so important issues that, given enough examination, become maybe more important than we originally thought. I will throw a few grenades on the table, some Quixotic tilting at sacred windmills to mix metaphors, and I hope that during the question and answers we'll pick some of that up.
Throw them that way.
I'm sorry?
Throw them that way, not
yeah, throw them that way. I noticed on the program for this reconstruction and recovery. My office is reconstruction and stabilization. Now, if I were, as we in the government tend to be, paranoid, I would think you did that on purpose. You don't want to do stabilization. You want to focus and skip straight to the recovery part because that's where your true passion lies and that's where your expertise is. And there are probably budgetary consequences of this omission of stabilization. I did just come from a conference similar to this in Paris where we argued for about an hour whether or not they were correct to call it stabilization and reconstruction or we were correct to call it reconstruction and stabilization. This is true. Truth is stranger than fiction sometime. Zach, next slide. Let me just start by hitting the nature of the intervention. I frequently find when I attend large groups of people within the U.S. government that we think we're talking about the same thing when in fact we're not. We're talking about different things. When I talk about post-conflict interventions, they're typically multinational and multilateral, meaning they involve NGOs, international organizations, non-state actors. They're typically some sort of stabilization, transformation, or reconstruction activity. They may have all those. It may be in that order. It may not. It's typically less than a peaceful environment. The whole notion of post-conflict is laughable. For those of you who've been there, you know, post-conflict is in the eye of the beholder. When I was in the military, we had a saying, no conflict is low intensity when you're caught in the middle of it. So this notion of post-conflict is somewhat questionable. There are typically some sort of constraints that have to do with the security of our international and domestic partners. It may be an international military force, it may be a domestic security force, but there's some sort of international or domestic security presence that we have to work with. I included a quote from the Devil's Dictionary, which I think is actually more accurate than not, about the notion of the alliances and the peace that we're seeking. Devil's Dictionary, for those of you who can't read it, is the period in international politics is the union of two thieves who have their hands so deeply in each other's pockets they can't possibly plunder a third party. And peace is defined in the dictionary as a period of cheating between two periods of fighting, which unfortunately I think is more true than not. Zach? I use this slide a lot, and I apologize if some of you have seen it before, but it's my first challenge with respect to how we can optimize our outcomes. If you look at this slide, and if I asked you to write down on a piece of paper what you see, I would get 2 or 3 different answers. And in fact, I've used this slide for probably 3 or 4 years, and only a few months ago did somebody point out to me, not only is there a beautiful young maiden and what they call the old crone, but there's also a Scotsman with a mustache there. Now, being a healthy heterosexual male, I block out the Scotsman. I don't like all that facial hair. But you can see any of the 3, but the nature of a gestalt, I'm told, is that you can never see all 3 at once. And as we move into more sophistication and more capacity building of our own ability to optimize our outcomes, one of the things that we as policymakers and we as practitioners have to be able to do is move from a gestalt where you can only see one perspective at a time to a sort of a paradigm. Whereas Dr. Slaughter was talking about, through evidentiary and science-based thinking, we can evaluate multiple different perspectives at the same time. Zach, next slide. This one is another slide that I use, and I think it's a slightly different problem that we face in terms of maximizing our outcomes. You perhaps know the parable of the 6 blind men describing an elephant. It's a continent of India story. 6 blind men, each speaking a different language, are tasked to describe an elephant. Each one of them describes their piece of the elephant in their native tongue, and they do it correctly, and they do it superbly, and in some cases poetically. But the point here is each of them, though correct, none of them are sufficient. And what's actually missing is the interlocutor who speaks all 6 languages and who can integrate the 6 necessary but not sufficient definitions into a holistic perspective. And I hope we'll talk more about common operating perspectives and common vision, unity of effort. Those are some of the things that I think are necessary if we're truly going to optimize our outcomes. Next slide. Hit it again, if you don't mind. This slide is going to build, and the point of this one, I use this one when I talk to UN audiences. What we think is an optimal outcome depends on who we are. You're looking at a set of swing sets that are building under a tree, and the big slide is telling you what each of the different actors thought they were asking for. Was it a simple swing set? What the NGOs prefer, which is nothing at all perhaps? What the contractor wanted to provide? What the field had actually requested? This slide is not meant to be merely entertaining. It's meant to keep you awake after lunch. But it's also meant to point out that what we see depends on where we sit. If you are a congressional staffer, if you're on the staff of one of the appropriating committees, your perspective of a particular program in a particular country is different than if you're the person in the field who's actually trying to execute that program. Next slide. Hit it one more time. This one, I think, highlights that point specifically. Metrics are enormously important. Dr. Slaughter spoke, and here's where I somewhat disagree with the notion of science-based or evidence-based metrics in decision-making. How do you impose evidence-based metrics on conflict prevention? You can't. It's epistemologically not possible to prove you prevented a conflict. You can accumulate anecdotes, but how do you prove that you prevented a conflict? How do you impose these kinds of metrics on a program like American Libraries or the Fulbright Scholarship Program, where the value of those programs is evidenced over decades, not months and not even years, but decades? So I have a problem when we talk, and I understand the tension. There's a need to be accountable to the American taxpayers. And to the voters who vote for the politicians who in turn fund our projects. But we also need to constantly push back against this attempt to overly muscularize and overly create metrics that are overly quantifiable and scientific. Next slide. These are 2 points, and I think they're about the last 2 that I'll make. I tell people frequently pronouns are important, and that's what do we mean by we? This is relevant both inside agencies, where within USAID, those of you who know the agency know that the bureau you're talking to may not be in necessarily the best of graces with other bureaus. It's also relevant among the interagency. One of my great frustrations and great challenges in SCRS is working with people who all draw taxpayer dollars as employees of the U.S. government, but there is no collective we involved in this process. I mean, the bureaucracy of the U.S. government is as fractured as any. I mean, people say, well, it was worse when you were with the UN, and I have to tell them, no, it really wasn't. It was very similar. These large organizations produce equities and loyalties that are often quite divisive. The next slide, please. The myth of the international community. This is one of my favorites. When I was in Kabul for 3 or 4 years, and before that in Sarajevo, people would say, well, the international community will take care of something. And that's not true. It's not even possible for that to be true. The international community in Kabul no more exists than does an international community in the business class lounge at Heathrow Airport. It's a lot of international people speaking a lot of languages, all of them in the same physical place at one time, but for different reasons. They may be competitors, they may like each other, they may not, but you certainly can't describe them as a community. Last slide. There's an issue of being involved or being committed. I think it's an important one. For those who can't see the slide, when you have bacon and eggs for breakfast, the pig is committed, the chicken's just involved. It's okay for the military or for certain agencies to just be there for a while. But there are NGOs and there are others who've been there for decades, and we need to recognize the differences and the consequences of those differences. And then the really last slide is the, go ahead and hit it 3 times. These are my solutions, and it's just 3 small ones. There's dozens, and I hope we'll talk during Q&A about them. How can we define who the actors are and establish responsible roles among them? How can we identify and empower to some degree a first among equals who leads the engagement? And how can we establish common metrics that we can at least all agree to disagree about, but some set of metrics that we can use to evaluate whether or not we're actually making progress towards optimization? Thank you.
Thank you very much, colleagues, and to SID colleagues and some new friends. I'm delighted to be here. As you know, my name is Jim Scheer, and I just want to say at the very outset, this may be the first time in history that the State Department colleague has shown up with PowerPoint and the Defense Department colleague is bereft of PowerPoint. So you're covered, and maybe there's a capacity building issue there. Anyway, it's a great pleasure for me to be here to join with my good friend Johanna Mendelsohn-Foreman and my colleagues Larry Sampler and Elizabeth Katashvili for this panel this afternoon. As you've heard from Johanna, I'm a newbie here. I've been in office exactly for 1 week. And as a consequence, I don't think you'll be too surprised when I say that I'm not here to preach or pronounce on policy, but perhaps I can offer some personal views, and I'm speaking